This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. In part 1, we focused on the structural issues, of which there were many. But now that the painting is stabilized, it's been lined to a new piece of canvas, we can start focusing on the image. And the first thing that I need to do is start removing this old yellowed varnish. After making several tests and gathering a lot of information about what this varnish is composed of, I can start removing it using a solvent-dipped swab. You can see at first it is slow going. The solvent is very mild and is just taking a little bit longer to break down that varnish layer. But as it does, we can start to see the varnish being picked up by the swab and get a hint of the colors that lie beneath. Now, this painting appears to have been varnished multiple times on top of old varnish. There are several layers, and so removing it is a slow and tedious process. There's just no fast way of doing this, and switching to more aggressive or higher concentration of solvents is a risk that I just don't want to take. After all, this painting is 470 years old. Who cares if it takes me a little bit more time to clean it? But underneath this old yellowed natural resin varnish, which has deteriorated with exposure to air, oxygen, and ultraviolet light, well, we can see that there are some really great colors. The reds are, well, red and not orange. The whites are, well, yeah, white and not yellow. And you can see, as I remove this with a little bit of a raking light, the textural difference between the areas that have been cleaned and the areas that have not. This varnish layer is so thick, it makes me wonder if it wasn't just poured on the surface and then allowed to settle, which of course is not what we want. We want varnish to be thin and not obscure the delicate brushwork of the artist. In addition to removing the varnish, some of the old retouching that was on top of one of those layers of varnish is going to come off, which is good, but it's also revealing lots and lots of damage. Now, getting a painting clean and removing all of the old varnish is obviously one of the most exciting parts about any conservation project. This notwithstanding. Unfortunately, this is taking a long time. The multiple layers of varnish are just very difficult to remove, and it has me realizing that this is going to be a very, very tedious process, and it's going to consume much more time than I budgeted for. Ultimately, that's fine for me. Again, this painting being 470 years old, we're not in any hurry. But imagine if everything we did took this much time. Ugh. That would be exhausting, particularly for things that should be easy, like building your website. Pretty hard pivot, Julian, I know, but hear me out. If building a website took as long as cleaning this painting is going to take me, well, nobody would ever do it. That's ridiculous. But with Squarespace, it's as simple as click. They've taken all of the hard work out of designing, building, and launching your website. Simply go online to squarespace.com, find a template that you like, click launch, and there you go. All you have to focus on is filling it with whatever tickles your fancy, be it your business, be it your passion, be it your art. And if you want, you can expand upon your website with another click. You can add a gallery, you can add a contact form, you can even add an e-commerce solution if you want to sell something. It really couldn't be easier. So head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner for 10% off your first website or domain. Without a doubt, cleaning the crest was exciting. Seeing some of those colors, the whites, the reds, the bluish green come through was really, really neat, and it gave me an idea of what to expect from the rest of the painting. And so now I'm turning my attention to the gloves and the hands of the male. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that his gloves are not yellow, and you can see the test I made on the finger reveals that I was right. They're not. They're bright white. And man, they are bright. Just look at the difference between the area that's been cleaned and the area that still has varnish on it. It's almost like they are two different paintings. The white is so bright, so crisp, so clean. Not only does it make the gloves look different, but it really speaks to how important this person was. I mean, these gloves are crisp white dress gloves. And I suspect his hands are also a little bit more lively. And sure enough, there's beautiful pinks, beautiful light colors, and a real delicacy to the way he's holding his other hand. All of that was just flattened by the old varnish. Now, of course, if cleaning the gloves and the hands were exciting, well, the faces of the characters are the showstopper. Just right off the bat, cleaning her veil, you can see just how different she's going to look. We can see beautiful whites, a little bit of gray in there, some blues even. But what we can also see is the extent of the damage, because that was obscured by the old varnish. And while the varnish is coming off, so too is some of the overpaint. At some point in the past, perhaps many times, it was retouched, and this retouching was executed on top of the old varnish. And while that is not a good practice for many reasons, among them the fact that the colors won't match, and that any removal of the varnish will take off the hard work of retouching, in this case, that's actually a good thing. That the old overpaint, done in oil I might add, was sitting on a layer of varnish meant that removing it was as simple as removing the varnish, for anything on top of that varnish layer would come off. I didn't have to employ any aggressive solvents, no scraping. It was just a matter of focusing on removing the varnish. And with this varnish receding, we can start to see just how delicately she was painted. We can see the beautiful flesh tones. But we can also see how the artist decided to execute the underpainting. And by leaving some of that underpainting showing through, that's how the artist created the shadows. Rather than adding on top of the paint, he let some of it shine through, which is a truly masterful execution. So now, after several days of removing varnish, day in and day out, from the time I arrived at the studio to the time I left, the painting is now clean. And now I can begin taking samples of the paint for testing. We've decided that in addition to carbon radiodating some of the materials, the canvas and the wooden support, we are going to take some samples of the actual paint layer and have them analyzed to see what they're made of, to see if they can tell us anything about this painting's construction or its execution date. So I'm taking a scalpel and very carefully, just on the edge of where there is already some loss, chipping up some of the paint. Now, of course, taking paint samples is a destructive process, and it's one that we take very seriously. We don't willy-nilly scrape off paint from a painting. But there is no other way to test these materials other than taking a sample. And so by taking a sample from an area that already has damage, we can limit the impact of that sample. And you can see I'm taking a tiny amount of paint, which actually the lab will find humorous because this is way more paint than they need. But it's always good to deliver them a little bit more in case they want to run multiple samples and different tests. And just like with the other samples, I'm going to create a chain of custody. I'm going to seal these up in containers. I'm going to label them, and then I'm going to photograph them next to where the sample was taken so that I have a documentation of the sample and the paint from where it was taken. Now, I'm going to take several samples because I want to get a broad range of analysis done on this painting. I've taken a sample of the red, And I'm also taking a sample of the white, the gold, the bluish green, and the background. And taking a bunch of samples is going to give me the widest set of data to interpret. Of course, we want to make sure that we don't find any red flags, and so taking a variety of samples helps to do that. So once I have gathered all of my samples, I can then prepare them for delivery to the lab, and then it's out of my hands and into theirs. Now, while the labs are working hard, no doubt, I still have a lot of work ahead of me. This painting had lots of losses, not only from the tear, but from, well, being around for potentially 471 years. And so I have to fill these gaps in. Not only because there is no surface onto which I can retouch. Of course, where there is missing paint, I can't just add paint. I need a surface that will be receptive to paint. But also because even if I could somehow just paint over those cracks, the color may match, but the texture wouldn't. And you would see this when you looked at the painting. So I'm going to fill in these cracks with a water-soluble chalk-based fill. And I'm going to go over the cracks, forcing it into all of those voids, and then clean up some of the excess that's on the surface of the painting. Now, because this is water-soluble, I can remove it, so I'm not terribly concerned about overfilling and leaving a large area. It will come off in the next steps. But there is a lot of fill-in work to be done here. And as you can see, lots of little areas of loss. And I'll make multiple passes because I will miss things on the first go-round. So I will swivel around the table, keeping my eyes peeled for any little divots, any little nicks, chips that I missed on the first pass, or second pass, or third pass. I want to make sure that I get everything now because it's much easier to take care of at this stage than later when I've already started the retouching process. Not impossible, but much easier. After letting the fill-in medium dry for a day, I can come back and start to remove the excess. Because of course, you can see I got a little heavy-handed here, and I can't just leave this on the painting. There's actual paint that's being covered by this fill-in medium, and just leaving it or painting over it, well, that's bad practice and not something that I would do. So using some cotton swabs, dampened with water, I can soften up this fill-in medium and use my fingers to check to see if it's smooth. I can feel any slight variation, and where there is a variation, I will go back in and add more fill-in medium, remove it, add more, remove it, until I get a surface that I'm satisfied with. And unfortunately, this is a very tedious process. There's just no fast and easy way of doing it. If there was, you'd bet I'd figure it out. Now, sometimes I will find an area that is high or low, and I'll need to go back in with my scalpel to remove material that I couldn't with these swabs. And in this case, I'm just shaving off a little bump that was there, and making sure that this area is pancake flat. This painting has almost no impasto, so I need to make sure that my fill-in matches that relatively flat surface. Now, even though I have removed the majority of the fill-in, there is still some residue on the painting, so I will come back with a little bit of solvent and just pick that up with some cotton balls. This isn't anything terribly complicated, but it is a good step that makes sure that I get all of this residue off of the painting. I don't want this stuff contaminating the varnish layers that I'm about to put on. Now, before this painting can be stretched to this strainer, I have to address this inlay that I put in when I took the sample for the testing of this wood. I'm using a Japanese saw to flush cut the edges, and once that's done, I'll just use a little block plane to bring it down to about the level of the rest of the wood. Once that's done, I'll switch over to a Japanese chisel and just work this patch until it's flush and smooth. This may seem like an excessive amount of time to be spending on something that almost nobody will ever see or take notice of, but at some point, somebody will. And while I will probably be long gone, I'd like to think that they will look at this and say, "Job well done." Now, I'm also going to be adding a little lip onto this strainer. It didn't have one, and the wood sat directly against the canvas. And while I have lined the canvas with an interleaf, I'm not concerned about that contact creating a line or a crease on the painting. But it's still a good practice to make sure that there is some airflow and that the wood doesn't touch the canvas, except at the very edge. So I ripped down some oak, and then using a little bit of wood glue and some brads, I'm just going to put it into place, nail it down, and then let it dry. And this will be plenty of support to make sure that this doesn't move and that the painting will have a little bit of airflow and that it will be off of this strainer. Maybe it's just the fact that I have these tools and I like woodworking that I do these little projects, but I think that it's a good practice. I'd want to be judged on the totality of the work that I execute, not just what people can see. So, on to stretching. I've let this strainer support dry for a couple of days, and now I can place the canvas onto it, align it, and begin the process of affixing it to this support. Now this is a strainer. It doesn't have keys, it is a fixed support, and generally I would recommend replacing it, but for a couple of reasons we've chosen to keep it. One, the painting is interleafed with a rigid PET film in between the two canvases, so the painting can't be keyed out, and it's not going to move with humidity changes, so needing a stretcher isn't actually in play here. But two, this is an old support. While I don't think that it is original, this may be 200 or 300 or 400 years old. We'll find out soon enough. And throwing it away just to replace it with something new seems silly. Now there is this little remnants of a label here, and I'm going to put a piece of PET film, the same that I use for the interleaf, on top of it. And then I'm going to use 4 little brass screws to hold this in place. I've chosen not to remove this label from this support after talking with McGregor because we felt that even though it may have no consequence, keeping it where it was and with the original support was important. Some clients want me to remove these, mount them onto acid-free mat board, and then mount that mat board onto the support. Some wish that I do this procedure. It really doesn't matter to me. My goal here is to make sure that it doesn't get damaged and it stays where it should. So once the stretching is complete and the label is protected, I can begin tacking down the remnants of the lining. Now I'm going to trim it here so that it doesn't cover up that little label. And while this is not my ideal way of doing it, it works, and ultimately having this little cutout doesn't have any effect on the lining structurally at all. And ultimately, when it goes back in the frame, nobody is ever going to see this. And actually, frankly, if they do, they'll understand completely why I did it this way. So, yeah, it doesn't look as crisp and clean as I normally like, but it is totally okay. And I'm okay with that. The goal here is to make sure that the label can be viewed. So, painting stretched, everything taken care of. Now I can begin the process of preparing it for retouching. And the first thing that I'm going to do is apply a synthetic resin coating. And this is an isolation layer. And the reason that I'm doing this here is not to protect the painting. This painting is very strong and durable. The reason I'm doing it here is because I need to be able to see these colors. And you can see that as I apply this resin, the colors change. And if I didn't do this, it would be almost impossible to properly execute the retouching. You see, I'd be retouching against washed out dry colors. And then when I went to varnish it, well, everything would change and my retouching wouldn't look correct. So in this case, the isolation layer or this synthetic resin coating allows me to see the painting as it will look when I apply the final varnish. This simulates what the finished product will look like. Now after the resin coating has dried, I will transfer the painting over to the easel and begin the process of retouching it. Now it is going to take quite a while to retouch this painting. Some of these areas are actually pretty easy to retouch. The reds, for instance, the whites. The skin cones are also pretty easy. But some of the background, those green, brown, black glazes, those are hard. So I'm going to start with the easy parts, the reds. And you can see just where paint is missing is where I'm putting new paint. There is a lot of damage here. And on top of the obvious areas that need to be retouched, these areas that I've filled in, the white areas, there are also areas where the paint has been abraded, or in the past where maybe the canvas folded or crinkled and some little bits of paint came off. Now, it is tempting to take a thick brush and just glaze in this whole area, do it in one fell swoop, and, well, maybe nobody will ever notice. But that's not how it's done. So I'm just trying to break up the areas, these brownish, reddish areas, where the paint has been damaged. Certainly, where the paint is lost, I can retouch it fully. But in some of these areas where the paint is just kind of affected, it's not a matter of simply painting over it. I just have to break up the appearance of that damage to try to unify the picture, or at least disguise it from our eye. Now on this painting, there are also areas of old retouching that are so old that no chemical approach was able to remove them, and no mechanical approach was able to remove them safely. That is, there was no solvent that was going to take off this area, and scraping it would have damaged the underpaint. So I simply have to retouch over this bad retouching. At some point, 100-year-old retouching, 200-year-old retouching, 300-year-old retouching, well, that's not really retouching anymore. That's just paint, and it becomes a permanent part of the painting. One reason we don't use oil paint anymore for retouching. So in this case, I can't get that stuff off, and I'm not willing to try an overly aggressive approach. If in the future there is a better approach, maybe lasers or a new solvent approach, well, good. That conservator can address that problem then. But for now, because I don't have a laser, and I don't have a bag of unicorn tears or elf spells that can get this stuff off, I simply have to reintegrate it best I can. And that's by retouching over it, to at least make the image cohesive. So I will use the cues from the surrounding areas to rebuild this area. And if I see something that I've done that I'm not actually comfortable with, I will remove it or retouch over it and modify it, just like that little flower. First go around wasn't so great. Second, much better. And I may come back to this area and do it again if in a couple of days I take a look at it and I'm not satisfied. But this is how we can address areas of damage that can't be reversed. Yes, it's imperfect, but at least now the image is cohesive, and the damage is still there if somebody wants to take a crack at it. Now, just as the cleaning of the woman was the most exciting part of that process, the retouching of the man is going to be the most interesting and exciting of the retouching process. He is very damaged. We can see that right off the bat. Unfortunately, the majority of his hair was removed during a past cleaning. There's also some fundamental damage and paint loss there. His face was also overly cleaned. We can see just how much of the underpainting is shining through. There's a major tear right through his eye, which of course we have to address. And so I'm going to be working slowly and delicately to bring him back into focus. I don't want to simply overpaint all of the areas of damage. I want to break them up. And by break them up, I mean try to change how our eye sees them, change how our brain processes them. So in some areas where there is fill-in medium, I can simply paint in those areas. But other areas where, let's say, the cheek has been abraded and some of the underpainting is shining through, I'm using a transparent paint. I've thinned it out and added more medium to thin out the concentration of pigment. And I'm just dotting over those areas so that the damage doesn't seem so strong. Now, I'm not overpainting them, but I'm trying to break them up so that we pass over them when we look at the painting. We don't see those individual trees, we see the forest. And this is an area where conservators may have a million different opinions. Some may say, leave it as is. Some may say, reintegrate it. Some may say, use an approach that allows us to see the retouching from close, but not from afar. All of those are completely valid. It's really up to the conservator and the client to choose the best approach. And because all of these paints are reversible, if in the future a conservator decides that my approach wasn't correct, or the times have changed, or a new client wants something different out of this painting, well, in my report and on the back of this painting, there will be notes about what I used, so they can have at it. Now, another thing that is tricky when retouching a painting that has this much damage is how to know when to stop. Because I'm looking at this painting really close up, maybe 6 inches away, and so I am seeing every little chip, every little abrasion, and you can see it too. But we have to avoid the temptation to touch up every single one, because that sends us down a slippery slope, whereby every little issue must be fully corrected. And that means we're going to basically be overpainting the entire painting. So by allowing some of the wear to show through, we make sure that the painting still retains its feel of being 471 years old. We don't want this to look new. We just want it to look like itself. And that's just about removing the damage, not all of its age. After several weeks of retouching on and off, I can't sit in this chair 8 hours a day retouching. I would lose my mind and my retouching would suffer. I have finally finished. And now I'm ready to apply the final coating of varnish. Now, this varnish is a synthetic resin that has an ultraviolet stabilizer. It's called a HALS, Hindered Amine Light Stabilizer. And it does a couple of things. One, it protects the varnish layer from being corrupted by UV light, but it also stops UV light from getting through the varnish layer to the paint, and that will help my retouching not change. The painting itself probably isn't going to change anymore. It's 471 years old, but my retouching, even though it is light fast, could if it was bombarded with UV light. So the UV stabilizer in the varnish kind of is like that coating on your windows that prevents the UV from getting in and bleaching out your couch. I know it sounds kind of silly and commonplace, but same basic effect. In addition, this final varnish will allow me to adjust the sheen and make sure that the painting just looks really good. And so as I go ahead and brush this out back and forth, well, I'm done. And that's it. Well, that's almost it. Hey, McGregor, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you, Julian?
Well, thanks for joining me again. It's been a while since we last spoke, and a lot of work has taken place on the painting, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I'm happy to say that it is all complete. Now, I have sent you a link with a video showing you the transformation, and without further ado, I'd love to see what you think of the painting.
I am absolutely so excited, Julian. I'm so ready to see this painting right now. Oh my gosh. That is unreal. The colors, they just have they just pop now. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, there was quite a bit of dirt, grime, old varnish, lots of old varnish. It was so thick, it seemed like it had just been added upon layer after layer after layer, such that the brushwork and the texture of the canvas was just completely obscured. So getting it off was a real effort, but obviously, I think it was well worth it.
Yeah, no, the work you do is just unbelievable. Like, honestly, I'm so excited about this. Like, I could not sleep yesterday night. I was so ready to see it, and it has not disappointed in the slightest. It is everything I hoped it would be. So thank you so much, Julian. for doing the work you do. And then also, I want to thank you for sharing it with everybody else too, because that's really exciting for me that everybody will get to share this experience. It's just amazing. So thank you.
Well, thank you for, again, trusting me with your project. It was really an interesting one. And what was really fascinating about this project was not only the work that was done, but the history of this painting. Now, I mentioned it's rare to have a painting with an inscription right on the front. And this inscription is in Latin, we know that, and I had it translated by some experts, and I know that you've done a little bit of research, and so I'd like to just compare what we found, the threads that we've pulled. So I discovered that this painting was likely executed to commemorate the marriage of two people, and that's Galacio il Pio and Margherita d'Este. And these two people were fairly well known. I mean, they were gentry class, and so it would not have been uncommon to have a painting to commemorate their marriage. These were important people. And the inscription doesn't translate exactly in English because it is, of course, Latin, but what it basically reads as is, to the spouses, or of the spouses, Galacio il Pio, the commander of cataphracts, and Margherita d'Este, the half-sister of the Marquis of Ferrara, flourished or commenced in 1450 AD. There's one part that is interesting, however, and that's the part pro Maximilio Imperatore. And in my translation, it seemed to reference Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. But the problem is that Maximilian I wasn't even born in 1450. He was born in 1459. So that presents a little bit of a problem. Is this referencing Maximilian I or something else? But it's a little bit confusing. So I'd love to hear if your research clarified any of that.
You know, that's a really interesting point, Julian, and I think I might have an explanation for you. So in Latin, Maximil would be derived from Maximus, which can mean greatest or great. So that's how I interpreted it in my own translation of the text.
Now, in addition to the research on the painting and the sitters, I got curious about who the potential artist could be. So I pulled that thread as well. And it's unsigned, which makes it, of course, very difficult. There's no provenance, so we don't have anything to go off of except historical records. Margherita d'Este was the legitimate daughter of Niccolo III d'Este. Now, Niccolo III also had a good dozen other children, some legitimate, some illegitimate, as was common back then. One of his legitimate children was Borso d'Este, who was a wealthy gentry class landowner, just like his father. Another of his children was Baldassare d'Este, but he was illegitimate. He also was a painter, fairly talented one at that. He also went by the name Vincino da Ferrara, who coincidentally was the painter of the portrait of Borso d'Este. So we have three siblings, Borso, Baldassare, and Margherita, all living at the same time. We have one of those, a fairly well-known painter, and that's Baldassare. We have a painting of his brother, Borso, and now we have a painting of his sister, Margherita. So it isn't such a huge leap to think that maybe, just maybe, Baldassare d'Este painted this painting for his sister, maybe as a wedding gift, maybe because he loved her, maybe he was paid to do it.
That is so interesting, Julian. You know, I think Baldassare is absolutely a possibility for this painting. In my research, I also found some other extremely intriguing artists. So I'm going to start with Piero della Francesca, 1415 to 1492. And he's a very well-known Renaissance artist, obviously, and he traveled all over Italy. He was very well-known. But what's interesting is that Piero della Francesca spent a fair bit of time in the Ferrarese court, where Galasso, Pio, and Margherita were consistently throughout history. So the second would be Cosimo Tura, and he works in the timeline as well. He's 1430 through 1495. And Cosimo Tura, it's called Portrait of a Young Man during the 1470s. And it's an extremely similar piece to this. So that's a real possibility as well. The next, like you mentioned, Baldassare Estense. And that makes sense because he painted on canvas, which is extremely uncommon for the 15th century. And then, so the final artist I have is Giovanni da Oriolo. And he was active 1439 to 1474. And it's very interesting because he's only got one known painting, and it's of Leonello d'Este. And Leonello d'Este was Margherita's brother. And he was also full brother to Borso d'Este. Very similar style too. And what's interesting about that piece, it has the same Latin text at the top. So that might be a real possibility there.
Well, that is a really interesting lineup of artists, McGregor. To think that this potentially could be a Della Francesca is super exciting. Obviously, he is the home run hitter, the superstar of those artists, but they are all really interesting and important artists nonetheless. So any one of them would be a great addition to history. And speaking of which, we know a lot more about this painting now than we did in the beginning. And hopefully, when the lab tests come back, they'll help us fill in some of the questions that still remain. So if you are curious about what those lab tests reveal, well, you're just going to have to join in on Patreon to find out. Because next time, I'll be speaking with McGregor about those tests and what they tell us and don't tell us about this painting.
Yeah, that was a pretty gnarly cliffhanger, Julian. But as promised, up on my Patreon will be coming the Epilogue, where I'll answer your questions about this project and, of course, invite McGregor back to talk about what we learned from the analysis of the samples we've taken. He'll also spend some time talking to me about the future of this painting, something that I'm looking forward to hearing about.